Thank you so much for joining us at our seventh equity conversation tonight. It is 4:35 California time. And as we are waiting for people to call in from various places, we quickly want to go through the Zoom etiquettes and set the expectations for the rest of the evening. If you are not being called upon, please stay on mute. But however, please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts or reactions or however you want to be engaged in the conversations. As I said, please help us to update your name if your name is currently not the true reflections of who you are. And throughout the conversation this afternoon, if you have any question, please utilize the chat box. If you would like to privately email me, or not email, but privately chat to me, feel free to do that too. We encourage you to switch your view into speaker view so that you can see everybody, all the panelists this evening. And last but not least, we ask you to be present because your present is very important to show respect to the panelists and the moderator. And it's also that we hope that you will enjoy all their stories this evening. So if you're wondering who I am, keeps talking to you, my name is V. Nguyen. I work as the Associate Director at Silicon Valley Education Foundation. Our vision at the foundation is that every student becomes successful and productive adults. So we specialize in STEM educations that inspires many underserved students to succeed in college and career across the Bay Area. So if you've never heard of us before, welcome to the Silicon Valley Education Foundations. For those who are return attendees of our past equities talks, welcome back. Why do we have this initiative of having bold conversations to confront the issues of race and equity in society and their impact on educations? At the foundations, we care a lot about building a strong foundation for our little children's. So it is important that we create a space to have such safe conversations and encourage many educators in the Valley to have and foster that kind of conversations. And second of all, we would like to ensure access and opportunity that leads to success of our students of colors, because we do know that they just happen to be the one who classify as underserved students the most. And last but not least, we would like to fulfill our obligation as the foundation to respond to what's happening out there in the world right now. There's only one outcome that we hope that everybody going to leave the conversations with, is to shift a little bit of your mindset and encourage everybody to have and start having courageous conversations. And for those who have never joined us before, this is your first time, what is a courageous conversation? We will later share a little bit with you about what that is when later on I introduce our Denise William. And this event cannot happen today. We have to thank you, our sponsor, the Knight Foundations and the County of Santa Clara. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce to you our Denise William, Chief Program Officer at the Foundations, and she will carry on to lead you through the rest of the night.
So good evening, everyone. We always like to start our conversations of equity. Just a reminder about 4 agreements of courageous conversations, that we all stay engaged and speak your truth. You have an opportunity sometimes to either put suggestions or comments in the chat or just speak up. If there's an opportunity to unmute yourself, then speak your truth with respect, of course. Experience discomfort. That's always you may experience that a lot of times, and that's okay, because you're not having an equity conversation if you're not experiencing discomfort most times, and expect and accept non-closure, so that you may not come to an agreement about some comment that's made today. We may have to come back to it another day, or it may come to you at another point in time in your life. But that's something that is very normal, to expect and accept non-closure. Next slide, please. So what's happening today? We're going to journey through the third condition, and I'll tell you about that in one sec. Then we're going to hear a panel with multiple perspectives. That's going to be very intriguing and exciting. And then at the end, we'll have a challenge to action, which we always like to conclude our evenings with that, so that you can not only be reflective, but take it back to your organization and see how you can continue this work. So I'd just like to share this poem, used with permission of Pablo Vega from Chapel Hill High School in North Carolina. We may have someone on from North Carolina. So anyway, it's entitled, I Dream. I am from a clash of color, from an idea of love modeled for others' perception. I see me as I am, but am hidden from others' views. I am who I am, but a living contradiction to my peers. I see life as a blessing, a gift granted to me. Why should my tent describe me? Why should my culture degrade me? Why should the ignorance of another conjure my presence? Too many times I've been disappointed by the looks, by the sneers and misconceptions of the people who don't get me, who don't understand why it hurts. I dream of a place of glory and freedom, of losing the weight of oppression on my back. I dream of the enlightenment of people, of the opening of their eyes. I dream for acceptance and for the blessing of feeling special just once, one moment of glory, for the true virtue in my life, for the glimmer of freedom and a rise in real pride. Thank you, Pablo, for that too. Next slide, please. So as we reflect on that, I'd like to specifically think about the I am piece. And in your reflection and in your feeling about what you've heard or what you've been thinking, maybe some other day, we're going to do an activity called I am. And of course, in the blank, you can put a phrase, a word, or something that describes you. I am, or how you're feeling. So it's kind of open. So you can share what you like. But when you put it in the chat, do not press return, because we're going to do an activity called the waterfall. So I'm going to give you a minute or so just to think about it, put it in the chat, and then I'll tell you when to push return. So let's go ahead and put our conclusive remark here. I am, and then hold on before you return it. About 30 seconds. One, two, three, return. Very nice. I see thankful, tired of feeling overwhelmed, Christian, proud mathematician, pura familia. I don't know if I said that right. Husband and father. Reflective educator. Very nice. Thank you. I didn't read them all, but I just wanted to share some of those. Okay, V. So today, as we continue to move forward with our conversations and our listening and our observing, we're going to delve into the third condition of courageous conversation, and that's engaging multiple racial perspectives. And one of the things that comes up in this notion is normalize. So social construction of knowledge, thus engaging multiple racial points of view in order to surface critical perspective. That's a lot. That's a mouthful. And our moderator is going to help us sort that out too, as she asks questions of our panel and as they share their racial perspectives. But just a little information on normalizing social construction is to acknowledge the process through which racial meaning is inherited, interpreted, and passed on from one generation to the next. Each of us create meaning around our current racial reality based on how we have experienced and understood our near and distant past. This condition enables educators to develop will, skill, and capacity for listening to and engaging with others' perspectives and experiences. Where and how people have grown up creates the lens through which they see the world racially. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Ingrid Hadley. Ingrid is a culture disruptor, curator of belonging and inclusion, advocate with 20 plus years of experience managing people and processes in the areas of global diversity and inclusion, operations, employee engagement, leadership coaching, and development. She approaches her work with the mindset that it is a joy to make space for everyone. She was born in South Central Los Angeles to an interracial couple prior to the Loving Act. Growing up Black in Los Angeles, she found her identity through her father's social activism, her community service, and the discovery of culture through the arts. She is a devoted mother and grandmother. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Ingrid Hadley.
Thank you so much, Ms. Denise. I must have you bring me up every single time I speak somewhere, because I don't think anyone has ever read my small biography so beautifully and eloquently. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Thank you so much. So listen, I am so excited to be here. I am someone whose business is founded on having courageous conversations. I love them. I often tell my clients, my tagline is I give you 2 chops to the throat and a hug, which means we're going to tear it up. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and then we're going to love each other to the next exit, right? So I'm happy to be here. What I want to do, though, is I believe that we're going to move on to introducing everyone prior to, there we go. All right. So if we can just get started, if you guys wouldn't mind giving your I am statements and a little bit about yourself, we can introduce our panelists. Ramona.
Hi, my name is Ramona Laughing Brook Schuster Webb, Afro Creek Muskogee. My pronouns are she, them, and they. I am the poet in residence in gynecology and obstetrics at the National Center of Excellence in Women's Health at UCSF. I work in the intersection between race, diversity, and gender, and equity, disparities in health, and art integration into healthcare practices. I'm also the artistic development director of the Queer Cultural Center of San Francisco, and a part of the Eastside Promise Board. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Ramona. Jamal.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. Good afternoon to everyone. Jamal Splain here, pleasure to be here. I am the Director of School Culture, Climate, Curriculum, and Instruction for the Los Gatos Saratoga High School District. And were we to also offer our I am statement as well?
Please do.
All right, well, here is my I am statement. I am the 17-year-old Black kid from Watts who landed on the ground in the Korean War in the 50s. I'm also the Mexicana from San Antonio who later met that guy and had to drive out of her own country and into Mexico to marry him because of the miscegenation laws in Texas at that time. Although I am a holder of multiple advanced degrees from one of the most rigorous higher education institutions in the world, I still am the double consciousness of W.E.B. Du Bois as a school administrator. I am a listener, I am a learner, and yes, I am a Dodger fan.
That's right. Yes, thank you, Jamal. Fernanda.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Fernanda Perdomo Arciniegas. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. And I am the interim director of Chicanx Latinx Equity at San Jose State. Prior to this, I work in student affairs as director of campus and community relations. And I worked with Silicon Valley Ed Foundation on a couple of large conferences for the Latinx community, the ALAS conference and the College Day. And so I'm going to follow suit as like Jamal did, and I'm gonna read my I am statement. I am someone who identifies as a woman, a white passing Latina who is Colombian, who has indigenous, African, Spanish, and Portuguese roots, a mother, an immigrant, a spiritual person who believes that everyone has a divine fragment within them, a long distance runner who finds peace in the trails, and a student, a learner for life, a connector, a supporter, and a servant leader.
I love it. Thank you so much, Fernanda. Vincent.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vincent. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm currently a third year at San Jose State University, and I was a student from the east side of San Jose. Currently, my role at San Jose State is that I'm an event coordinator and peer mentor for the Pride Center. And I'm going to read out my I am statement. I am ambitious, resilient, innovative, creative, an advocate, transgender, LGBTQ+, Vietnamese American, a lifelong learner, and an aspiring educator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you everyone for joining us. And my simple I am statement is just this. I am honored to sit with you all today because I am amongst greatness today. I'm amongst intersectional, intergenerational greatness. So I can't wait to get this conversation started. So here's the deal. I believe that we all understand this conversation is being led by the third condition, right? In Glenn Singleton's book, The Courageous Conversations About Race. And so what I did is I leaned into three concepts that I've prompted our panelists with. They're going to answer the questions from their perspective, right? You heard who they are. So they're going to take the questions that I asked them and they're going to make them apply to them and then provide, hopefully some great best practice for you all. So in the third condition, it's designed to support each of us in giving voice to our own racial experience. However, we may interpret that experience to have occurred. In other words, our lived experience, and these are my words, our lived experiences should be acknowledged and validated as different yet valuable. Okay, so that's the premise that we're going to begin on. I'm going to ask my panelists, anyone please jump in here. How does one's lived experience inform the way that they view race? Jamal, you're off mute.
Wonderful. Well, I think, first of all, thank you for the topic and for throwing this valuable start to the conversation off. For me and my truth, I think it's inescapable. The way my life experiences are a part of how I not only view race and race relations, but also in how I evaluate events that happen to me, that happen around me. And in certain ways, it is completely intertwined with every aspect of mind, body, and spirit in terms of my life experiences and how race and racial constructs and race relations come into play. So I think for me, my truth is that they're very difficult, if not inescapable, and they're always intertwined.
Right. It's interesting though, right? As BIPOC people, how we kind of go through the world and we experience the world one way and the world experiences us in another way, right? And then at the end of the day, though, I have friends that say to me, golly, Ingrid, you see race in everything. You see inequity in everything. And I'm like, well, I can't unsee it because it's kind of how I experience the world. So thank you for synopsizing that. Ramona or Fernanda, did you want to chime in?
Sure. Oh, go ahead, Ramona.
No, it's okay. You're welcome.
Okay, fine. Okay, when I read this question, I really have had an evolution. I've been in the US for 25 years. So of course, when I came to the United States, I landed here in California. I haven't left the state. I came from a very homogeneous society, starting from that. That doesn't mean that we don't have a large community of Afro-Colombians and indigenous people, as well from people from the islands, right? But my experience as a person who lived in a large city, I was born in the capital. Really, those experiences didn't give me the opportunity to experience or have relationships with those communities, right? Except for the one or two students that were, they were Black students or indigenous, right? So I come to the US thinking that, we don't have any issues with race. There is no problems with race in Colombia. What is this whole thing about race? And it's really living in this society that I start seeing myself as different and understanding also my privilege, right? When I was in Colombia. As I said in my I am statement, I am a white passing Latina. So if you looked at me and you perhaps didn't hear me speak, you will say, oh, where are you from? And I will get that, as a microaggression sometimes, like, where are you really from? And then also, when I say I'm Colombian, people will like, are you really Colombian? Like, you don't look Colombian. So is that questioning of the fact that people here have an idea of how Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people look like. Also getting the questions about my accent, for example, and having to explain that, or having this comments that were kind of like an underhanded polite comment of, oh, I love your accent, as opposed to, other Latinx accents, right? And so it's the idea that you are being paired against your own peers is another experience that I had. So I will say that it's been a learning process. It's been a learning experience. Also, my work in diversity has helped me tremendously to understand my own social identities. And so it definitely is the way we look at race, the way we look at this social construct is because of how we have lived through it. But I think that the important part of this is that the more we talk about it and the more we hear other experiences, the more we learn, and we can be more supportive, more creative, more inclusive.
No, I love that. And the couple of things that I got that I thought you said that were super salient. One was that, listen, we are not monolithic. All Latinx people are not the same. All Black people are not the same. And we know these things, but for some reason, we are still prescribed these identities that have nothing to do with us, right? Like, so that's the first thing. But the other thing that you talked about, and I'd love to get into it maybe a little further in the conversation, but this idea of privilege, right? Like we all have some level of privilege. Even myself as a cisgender woman, I have privilege over a transgender woman, right? But I think when we talk about privilege, we often only focus on white privilege. We don't focus on other privileges. And it's not really until we identify with the fact that we all have some level of privilege, can we really develop the empathy to hear someone else's point of view? Because we think, oh no, I get it. I had it bad too. I got, and the thing about it is like, no, there's still other experiences. I'm going to go to Ramona and then we're going to go to our next question. And I'm going to come to you next, Vincent. Thank you, Ramona.
Yes, thank you. When I think about my lived experiences and the things that really shifted the way my lens viewed race, I grew up in the South. I grew up in Louisiana, partially in Kentucky, and so my lens is very much post-desegregation. However, still living and attending segregated schools. My lens is very, I'm Black Indian, Afro Creek Muskogee, I'm African American and Native American, and that lack of visibility in the larger world around me, and how it was expressed through colorism growing up, and as it concerns shading and this appropriation of moral quality to things like hair and skin color, good hair, fair skin, things of that nature, I feel like made a huge impact on me growing up, and continue to make an impact on the way I'm able to see the privilege that I live within here in California, because it is a very significantly different life for me as a woman of color and a queer woman of color who's incredibly vocal as an artist. And so, the way I've experienced my race has been through experiences like Katrina, where you think at the very end of the day that your body and your being is worth something. And then 2 weeks go by with no response. And you watch your community perish around you, and you get a very clear idea of what your country thinks and what it feels about your life and your livelihood. And I think that those kinds of experiences removed a lot of places where I could have, where I felt more naive, where I thought that I was considered, that I thought I was, somebody to be watched after, valued, worthy, deserving, made human. And in the places where I have found that to not be true, have most certainly oftentimes come back to my race, class, color, caste, and sexual identity, sexual orientation and identity in the world. As somebody who's taken on the legal system and fought vigorously for 5 years to create justice in my own life around sexual assault as a woman of color, the way I was treated, the way the jury saw me, all of those things, this presumption of guilt, have shaded the way in which my lens views race in the world and how I get to exist within it. And I'll say more later. Thank you for listening.
No, I love that. It is a very stark moment when we realize that we are being tolerated and not celebrated in this world that we want to belong to, right? The space that we want to belong to. So thank you for sharing that. That was very transparent and I appreciate it. I'm going to go to Vincent. I'm going to throw this one to you. How important is it to normalize social construction around conversations about race and multiple viewpoints to surface contrasting, conflicting, or critical perspectives? And that's actually something that Mr. Singleton leans into in his book. So how important is it to normalize these conversations that we're having right now? Vincent, talk to me.
Honestly, I think it's super important because like so many years throughout like my childhood and like schooling, I've never seen like myself represented in school, like whether it be like with classmates, you can see like physically like, oh, like people may come from the same ethnicity or same background as you, but it's another thing to be like, oh, in a space where you actually feel validated for your identities. Because too many times, often and not, in the classroom, it's just like focused on like learning. You're supposed to learn this material, but like race comes into that question too. So I didn't really get that opportunity until actually college, where I had some classes where I taken on Asian American studies to be able to like have conversations about race. It wasn't a thing throughout high school or middle school. I remember learning about history, and I'm really glad that California is taking on ethnic studies to be able to have students to be able to start talking about who they are, how they bring themselves into the classroom. But I think that work has to happen just beyond even that class. Like it has to be embodied as like a practice that like it should be normal to talk about your experiences. It shouldn't be like shameful. You should be able to walk into like a classroom and feel proud of like who you are. Speaking from like my personal experiences, like I didn't really understand about like what it meant to be like Asian or Vietnamese American until like I had an eye-opening class this past in the spring, and it was through the Asian Pacific Leadership Institute, where they offer programs for youth and college students and professionals. And from that experience, it was a safe space where I felt really supported, but also learned about like the history. Because like being second generation, there's that added layer of like not knowing who you are, which is really hard for like a lot of students. It's like, how do you like, you can hear about like your family history, but it's another thing to actually like learn like more things that come with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that came up for me after the racial reckoning was I have a ton of white friends, literally a ton. And they came to me and they were like, Ingrid, I didn't know. And there was a moment when I was like, how could you not know? And then I had to remember we learned from the same history books. And then I had to remember that it wasn't until I took an Africana American Studies class, Africana Studies class, and an African American Studies course in college, my first semester, that I actually was taught things that I had never learned before. As adept as my father was at being a community activist, there were still pieces of my history that I didn't know and I wasn't taught. And it didn't happen, but one time a year during Black History Month. So to normalize the contributions as well as the struggle of BIPOC people in our country is a great thing. Jamal, as an educator yourself, how do you think it's important to normalize these conversations?
Oh, it is super valuable. You know, if we really think about the concept and the construct of race and how, since these United States have been formed, that construct over time has been developed to justify sometimes against what our conscious can believe is justifiable, as depicting Blacks as, you know, subhuman, as property, as less than human. And I think it's also important to remember that, you know, these conversations that include race, that include multiple contrasting, competing perspectives, you know, they're messy. And I think that's another aspect to this in terms of when we're coaching up educators, coaching up students to kind of redesign their framework and to have them understand that we're not looking for the perfect outcome in these conversations. You know, sometimes kind of as a protective mechanism, we think, okay, if I'm not completely batting 1,000 and being able to convey that I'm not a racist, then anything less than perfection means I'm a racist. And I think I love how, Ingrid, you talked earlier, that blew my mind, how one can be in a place of privilege and on the other side as the same person, depending on the context. And that really, I love that, because it reminds me there's levels, you know, to the privilege game. And I think there's a spectrum of these conversations that we have, that we're looking just to grow together in coming together to understand kind of where our interests are as people, as partners, as members of a collective society who we're looking to level up opportunities for those that are going to come behind us. And that's messy work, and that's imperfect work. And I think the more we lean into our own imperfections as humans and as people, then we kind of clear the roadmap a little bit for engaging others in kind of imperfect conversations. And I think, you know, in this heightened day and age of you know, social media and cold, kind of contrived images, if you will, we get caught up in this, you know, I can't look like a racist. Or on the flip side, if I'm trying to approach a conversation, you know, I don't want to look like somebody who's telling you what to do or telling you how to think. And I think if we just kind of leave those notions behind and just lean into, hey man, from a personal perspective, I had an experience and I want to talk about my experience from this. And I think, and if we just kind of approach it from that standpoint and then just kind of go from there, it's not always going to have a good outcome, but I think it'll allow us to lean into those conversations a little bit better.
Yeah, I just want to just kind of recap what you said, because one of the things I'm consistently talking to my clients when we get to this place of it getting messy is I'm like, let's lean into humanity. Let's lean into humanity, right? What would you want someone to do for you, right? And when we put the mirror back on ourselves, then we can't help. Now, the unfortunate part is it does get messy because we realize that some people have a problem with humanity, right? And sometimes those are people that are making decisions, right? Especially for our children. So we want to be the culture disruptors, right? That say, it's okay, I'm gonna disrupt this culture. It's gonna get messy for a minute, but we're gonna grow to a path. We're gonna get on a journey together and we're gonna get to where we're going. We're not just on this journey. We're gonna get where we're going, but we gotta start. So I love that. I'm gonna go to my next question. I'm gonna go to Ramona and then I'm gonna come to Fernanda. But my next question is, so racial colorblindness. We hear this a lot with allies. It can be considered a microaggression. I know why I have my issues with racial colorblindness, or why I can offer a different perspective. But I think it's often offered as an opportunity to say, look, I treat everyone the same. I am not a racist, right? But how important is it to embrace the fact that racial colorblindness is not okay when we are trying to understand opposing points of view or different points of view? Ramona?
Yeah, erasure is never okay. And that's what I see and that's what I hear when I hear color blindness. You need to erase my color in order to hear, see, or treat me fairly. That this somehow has something to do with how I deserve to be treated. It is, it's giving a certain silence to the violence of discrimination, of bias and implicit bias, and it's a part of what allows us to protect white fragility, because this is a big hinge point that many of us are socialized into doing just naturally. And our need to protect white fragility dissuades us from oftentimes speaking up. When hearing things like, oh, I'm colorblind, I'm like, well, at least they're working in the right direction. At least they're trying to become more enlightened and realizing that they need not to discriminate against me based on my color. But why could you not love me based on all of who I am versus excluding the parts that make you uncomfortable? And because they make you uncomfortable, that's why it seems that you need to be blind to it, because otherwise you could celebrate me as sacred, as loved, as valuable, as worthy, and as seen as is.
I mean, she gets snaps for that. I'm sorry, that was awesome. Thank you. Fernanda, talk to me.
Ramona said it all. I mean, really, what can I add to that? I think I agree absolutely and completely with her statement. I will say that when you hear that expression of I don't see color, I would just see or feel, well, you don't see me and my experiences. And at the same time, it's like you're taking away anything else that I can provide to you, because you really are putting me at a side, right? You're just seeing what you want to see. And and I am a complex person that has a lot of experiences and a lot of knowledge that comes from my color, from my ethnicity, from my race, and so when that happens, that creativity that comes from me, perhaps I'm not going to be that person that is going to participate, because I'm being invisible or invisibilized, right? Or maybe perhaps what I have to say is not going to be taken into account, because they don't see me as somebody who has all these stories and all these experiences different from them. So I feel that this whole thing of protecting other people because they don't want to be called racist, that's where we actually get to that difficult part of how much do we want to really open up and empathetically understand another person's experience. So yeah, so that's all I want to add to that.
I love that. And I'm going to go to Vincent, because I think it's important generationally to understand this, how colorblindness, I know, I'm not going to assume how old you are, but I think I have kids your age. And so I understand that, they're from kind of this rainbow generation. They're all friends. And just in high school, college, there's not a lot of conversation around race, right? Where we're from in the San Fernando Valley. And so I'm just wondering, generationally, how does that look to you? Are you comfortable with someone saying, well, I'm just colorblind, I treat everyone the same? Or how does that strike someone from your generation?
I would personally be very offended if someone went up to me and said that, because I'm like, you just erased everything about me. You just erased my history, my struggles. You don't understand my people. How can you say that you're like colorblind when you like have like, it's like you have to come from a place of privilege to be able to say that statement too. I would say folks from like Gen Z, like myself, there's a lot of conversations on social media now as like a platform where people are leveraging about like sharing different histories, different backgrounds, different celebrations. I've seen so many infographic posts on so many different identities and experiences that it's like phenomenal that people are starting to share this content. So we're gaining a greater awareness within Gen Z. But also, it's like, how do you even start a conversation about race and like how it affects like maybe your relationships or interactions? There's not much guidance on that. Personally, I'm privileged to be a part of a lot of social justice spaces on campus. So like I've learned how to like, I had this opportunity to attend a leadership retreat that one of the programs hosted on campus where we talked about race and identities and intersectionalities, but not a lot of students, like the general population, isn't like really involved in that. So it's like, how do you incorporate that into like the classroom practice where it's like, this is how I show up? As a business major, everything is like absolutely erased. Like your identity, who you are when you walk into the classroom, it doesn't matter because it's like a capitalistic like world where we're always pushed to like do stuff and know skills. But it's like who you are and what you bring yourself into the table. Like sometimes I try to strike conversations with people about race and identity, but then it also confuses and like weird, like it makes it really awkward for my peers to like kind of like get into that spot where they feel comfortable talking about it. And I haven't had any professors who were like willing to facilitate that conversation in their classes or anything like that before. So I definitely agree with you that like within like the generation of youth, like there is more conversation about it or more like advocacy work, but not necessarily intergenerationally within like classrooms and like what can further be expanded. Like if I met a professor who had like my same like background, it'd be really interesting if I could engage in a conversation about them like with shared identities, or maybe like learn from their experiences, like learning from you all, like your different generational experiences and backgrounds are like, it just broadens my perspective of the world. And I just believe people should have that more.
I love that reverse mentoring, right? Like, let's all be better together. I truly believe that your generation is going to change the world, though. I don't mean to put that on your shoulders, but I do. And I believe even those content creators that are on social right now, they're going to be driving content that these educators are going to be facilitating in their classrooms. You guys have no idea the impact that you have on the culture in general, right? And in an unapologetic way. And I love it. It gives me so much hope. So I'm going to go lead into a second construct from the book. And it says, to sustain a courageous conversation, white educators must avoid forcing onto others their own racial points of view. It's also important for them to acknowledge the perspectives and viewpoints of BIPOC educators. Now, I paraphrase that a little bit, but basically what Mr. Singleton was saying was that, like, it's one thing to teach from your perspective, but don't discount a person of color's perspective as an educator as well, right? Because we have done what we call, it's the white way, right? And the dominant culture, right? Like I told you, my friends called me and said, I didn't know. And I said, I know you didn't know because we learned from the same book. So this is what we're talking about disrupting in this culture now. So Glenn, I'm gonna ask you, Jamal, I'm gonna ask you this question first. How do you suggest educators begin to challenge the dominant point of view, often referred to as the white way, and introduce differing perspectives and materials to glean from? How do you do that? You're a teacher, you know it's not right, you want to do something different, the rest of the staff doesn't get it. How do you begin to disrupt that culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think to begin with, as a framework and as an approach, I think it's important that before even leaning into those moments, we realize that it's really important to be able to separate our who from our do. And what do I mean by that? So often we, unfortunately, as all of us do, we kind of attach everything we say and everything we do by way of employment, accomplishments. That's who we are. And I think it's important to kind of separate that. And if somebody has a point of view that we want to lean into and engage them and have a crucial conversation about race, that we kind of frame it as an approach that that's not who they are. That's something that they said, that's something that they did, but that's not who they are. Even if you have to, or we have to, give out a lot of grace, which probably ain't a bad thing in our world nowadays. The world could probably use a little bit more grace, and assume positive attentions, given out a little bit doses. So I think as an approach, getting back to the question, how do we suggest it happen? I think great questions lead to better answers. And as opposed to making a statement, about what you heard or what you saw or what you want to convey, using good questions like, we're in a planning session with a department and it's English and we're planning a unit, and somebody brings up some unit that doesn't allow for the full experience of the students and the backgrounds and the culture that they have. And a question, did that idea fully capture what you wanted to convey? And then probably going to go, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't know. Tell me more. So giving them the opportunity to unpack their thinking with more questions is typically a good entry point. Even if it's a microaggression or a joke, just, hey, did that fully capture, what we wanted to convey or what you wanted to convey? Definitely putting good questions that are reflective out there, even if it gets dismissed. My experience has been folks will walk away still thinking about that question, and we still have a good foundation that was not compromised between folks, if you will. So that's definitely a really easy strategy, is lean in with really good questions to get you going.
Right. So open-ended questions, right? Not interrogation questions that feel like accusations almost, right? That's great. I love what you said. It's almost like a calling in conversation, right? When you're really trying to call someone in and get them to kind of think about, well, what exactly, what was your outcome? What is it you are working toward? Because if that's the case and you can articulate it, then perhaps there's others in the room who can add perspective to get you to that place, right? I love that. I love that. And that's how we grow together, you guys. I think sometimes we feel as though we have to have all the answers, or when we do speak, as I think Jamal said earlier, we feel like we have to have the perfect answer. And there is no perfect answer. And so leaning into the fact that there is imperfection in all of this is great. But here's the biggest one: assuming the best in others. That's how we create a safe and a brave space. Is I have to believe that when you respond to me, that you really are, you're speaking from a place of concern or a place of actual inquiry. Like I want to know and grow with you. So that's great. Fernanda, talk to me. What do you think about this question? How do you suggest educators kind of disrupt that culture from the dominant view?
Well, here at South State, my office, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, we do presentations for departments, for units, for the colleges, and we invite, all faculty, their staff, chairs, deans, etc., to be part of these conversations, because that's another way to present the information, perhaps not telling them exactly how or what to teach in the classroom, but how their relationships with their students, with their staff, among the faculty administrators, how those things actually determine the sense of belonging and the sense of pertinency and appreciation that people feel in doing the work, in doing their call. Because a lot of people that work at South State or any university, there is this desire, right, to teach, to learn. Sorry, somebody here is yelling in my office. Okay. Anyway, so I think it's presenting the information in a way that people can access it at any point, right? So we do those presentations. We also have a newsletter, we have a blog, we have YouTube, we have a lot of resources that faculty and staff and as well as students can actually access. And these conversations are happening more and more at South State. So I think it comes from the top down as well, because the leadership wants this, wants to create and make sure that there are systemic changes in the university. So it's not just one person trying to make or afflict change, but it's also the fact that the university in its entirety and the administration is pushing for these changes. So when you see that happening, there is that the fact that these conversations and students like Vincent, for example, are bringing those conversations into class. And it's interesting that they was saying that kind of conversation is not happening in the school. And I feel is because faculty sometimes don't feel that they have the tools to do it, right? People are afraid of having conversations about race because, of course, there are going to be people who are going to have opposing views. And then what do you do with the conflict? And then we, a lot of us are averse to conflict. And then we tend to just get either to try to accommodate the other person or avoid it or compromise. And that's where the microaggressions actually take over in the classroom. So that's what we do with our faculty. We try as much as we can to give them the tools to approach the subjects, as well as make sure that when they are approaching the subject among themselves as well, they get to a conclusion that both of them are being heard and there is a solution, right? Not necessarily is an immediate solution, but it's something that is in the process of getting there. And I think that having the history or understanding our own personal histories, understanding, what Latinx students actually go through when they go to school, their struggles and their difficulties, as well as PITA students, African American students, and the necessities that they have. This thing that I was talking about before, the cognitive empathy that comes out of understanding somebody else's reality in a way that you can actually almost put your shoes, your feet in their shoes and understand what they go through, is where you create that sense of belonging and inclusion. So I don't know if it was a long answer for that, but I think
I love it.
it's a wealth of things that you have to do, right?
Yeah, it is. And I, the couple of things that stood out for me is, something like it's not a moment, it's a movement, right? And so I think what has happened in time, and look, I'm 58, so I've been doing diversity since it was called diversity, and it meant how many Black people do you have working there or going to school there, right? That's what people cared about, right? And so, which is not a bad thing, but it has evolved, right? And so when I think about it, I have often heard in corporate spaces, in spaces where educators are there, it's like, this is just a thing, like, let's just do this thing for right now, and it's going to ebb and it's going to flow. And I think what's important to lean into in this season is that it is never going away again. This generation, Vincent's generation, has changed that forevermore. They have righted the history books, whether we agree with it or not. So we have to lean into that. So Vincent, I want to ask you a question. When we talk about the dominant culture, we talk about disrupting it, and we talk about really creating as educators. So here's kind of the way I think about educators or anyone in leadership who is tasked with the E or the I, right, in equity and inclusion, is creating this safe space. And so when we talk about creating a safe space for students to be heard and for their needs to be met, it often, there are times when we do have to intervene and have conversations because someone has done something that is perceived to be unjust or racist, right? And we go to have a conversation with that person and they're like, no, it wasn't, right? No, I am completely right because my lived experience has shown me that I am right. How do you create, knowing that, how do you, I have so many questions here. How do you help a student navigate a situation like that, or students navigate situations like that? I think I want to go to Vincent first. I want to come to Ramona, but how do we engage with someone who absolutely has a different point of view, does not see anything wrong with it? How do we begin to engage them and offer them a different perspective other than offering them a different perspective? That was a lot.
Yes, that is a pretty complex question to kind of think through and process. I would say it, like, if someone is coming from a completely different perspective, it's generally that they're like unaware. So like sometimes, like a lot of schools nowadays, they have been implementing restorative justice as like a practice of being able to like kind of like exchange experiences, but also understanding something else deeper. Like it may just be like that their lived experience currently doesn't offer that perspective, but like engaging in further dialogue with the student might be helpful. Personally, like I'm just like, a lot of teachers aren't trained to be able to like facilitate those like like how do you even mediate that, or like conflict mediation in general. So it's kind of complex to navigate. I would say it might be useful to like, in that case, like have like the students like share out like, oh, like maybe like what kind of like hurt, like even though like intentions is different from like impact. So it's like how like they can connect on that level of like impact, like probably like some sort of experience which would further help to build like empathy. So it's like, how do you get the students to build empathy, even if it might not be that specific experience, they could somehow relate, and that could help like mediate and help the relationship become better. But honestly, a lot of educators nowadays, they haven't been equipped with that yet. And I think it's just something that we need to change in like teacher education, or make as like a regular practice to be able to like continue learning. Like you don't just finish learning after you finish your like teaching credential, but like how do you always go with like evolving needs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And so it's not just this and then that's it, right? Again, it's a movement. I often think of my son in high school who took nothing but AP course. It was on the dean's list, Black kid in a predominantly white school. And I remember going to the college fair and meeting the college, career counselor. And she asked Cody what he was doing there. She's like, what are you doing here? Like, she said that. And then I found out that she was talking to other kids about UCs and wasn't talking to Cody about them. My son goes to an HBCU, he goes to Howard U. But nonetheless, this is why. But I don't think that we as educators, I don't even know that she knew that she had done that, right? And so, Ramona, I'm going to throw it to you. What happens? How do you connect with that? And I don't necessarily mean as a parent, but how do you, aside from offering a different perspective, begin to shift someone's mindset or really get them to understand the impact? Because the intent, to your point, Vincent, I don't think was to be harmful to Cody. However, without me there intervening and seeing it, it could have had and it actually did have a little bit of an impact on him, if not a significant impact on him. So how do we do that? How do we navigate those conversations?
These things happen, relatively consistently and relatively invisibly, quite often. And I feel like where we find inquiry and where we find inclusion, as everyone has been sharing, we find change in community. This is where we find the ability and the language to call people in. I can give an example. I was hosting a meditation practice that was very specifically for Black hospital workers as a safe healing space. And a white staff and faculty member entered into the space, was asked to leave and refused to do so because she felt as though she had the right to meditate with everybody else. Maybe it was curiosity. And the incident was seen as something small and incidental. When she was asked to apologize, it was very flippant, as though, what's the big deal? I just sat in on your meditation, and what had to be explained, because it did not meet with a lot of resistance. What had to be explained was that this is a weaponizing of privilege. This is a violation of consent. This is also about using language that you can understand, that can reframe and recontextualize scenarios and situations without indicting people, but calling them to recognize the outcomes of their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because you needed to be present, everyone else was not allowed to be.
Wow, he snaps for that too. I love it. Thank you. Would anyone else on my panel have anything else, any other best practice to add to that? I think as educators, as kind of people at large and in charge, we are called to create these safe spaces and to hold space when people cannot. They don't have the words, and oftentimes students feel powerless. So it is our job in the space that we have to make space and then hold space for the truth, their truth, whatever the truth is, right? And lean into humanity. All right. There's another concept in the book that says we don't have to agree and we should expect non-closure, right? And I believe we talked about that earlier. That's important because I think I can tell you probably just about every argument I've had with a family member about race it ends in this anger, right? Because it's like, how come you don't see my point of view? Don't you love me? And I'm talking about my white family. Like, how can you say that? Don't you love me? And they'll say to me, I love you. But what that says is, I don't love everyone else. right? I think about it often because I think about how my parents chose each other, but their families did not choose them, right? So I'm the byproduct of not being chosen, born 4 years before the Loving Act. And so that has now informed, again, how I kind of move through the world. But I have to say it's hurtful. And it wasn't until I became skilled in this space that I could step away and not take it personally and drop a nugget and leave, listen for another space to drop a nugget, then actually see a vote change, right? That's big, right? So that's just kind of how I've leaned into it. But I'd love to hear if we can agree that we're not always going to agree and that we're going to have to pause in a conversation and come back. What does that look like? What does it look like to pause? What does it look like to re-engage? And what's the expectation? And I'm twisting the question just a little bit, and I'm gonna throw it to Fernanda first.
Well, your experience made me think of my own experience as well, because I think that when I will say that there is the expectation. So to bring it a little bit more personally, when I married my ex-husband, he's white and his family is white, from the East Coast. I always felt very welcome, right? And loved and appreciated and all that. But it's definitely a different thing when I was with his family in the East Coast, which had a little bit more of a more, I don't want to say racist, but it was a very, it was not as welcoming as the people from California. So definitely living in California changes you. So for me, I guess it was, I mean, I didn't have a lot of experience or a lot of time to actually change anybody's mind, but it was, for me, it was an exercise of listening empathetically, like listening to what they had to say, not react or overreact and start, a fight or get upset at what they were saying, but really trying to understand where they were coming from, and their experiences that they had in their own communities. I think that it comes from these place of ignorance, right? And so we do have to give grace to people that sometimes don't have a very limited view of what America is, basically the world is. If you think about it, the white race is the minority in the world. So, but we still have this Eurocentric view of everything. And at the same time, when we bring another perspective, they feel that we are, they feel either offended or they feel that we're telling them that they are racist. So I think that in my personal experience, I will say that there is a lot of teaching, but at the same time, a lot of grace that we have to give, which is hard because you, as the person who is being oppressed, are the one that is exerting the most amount of work. So it's a conversation of like, how much do you want this conversation or this relationship to flourish, right? Obviously, I'm not telling people here to be microaggress or macroaggress and, take it all in, because one of the issues with BIPOC folks is that we have the highest incidence in mental health issues, right? We don't feel safe outside. We don't feel safe inside. We don't feel safe in our places of work. We don't feel safe in our, places of study. So I'm not saying that you have to be the person that is going to be teaching and taking all in. But at the same time, I will say it's what kind of conversations you can can you have with your family or with the people that you care. And I know that, for example, last year, it was during COVID, there were conversations of like, we were all at that point, and the racial unrest and kind of like discovery by a lot of white folks that, oh my God, we didn't know what was happening when we have been living through this forever. It was also the fact that we, in a way, in a really unfortunate way, we were all taxed mentally because of the situations that we were in. So if you can find points of similarity when you're explaining why, you know, the experiences that you're having had an impact on you or negatively, either mentally in your mental health, in your physical health, at work, and bring those points of, you know, commonality with people that are not seeing eye to eye to you, I think that is the starting point. And I think it goes from there. So so that will be what I will say or add to this conversation.
Yeah, no, I like what you said. You know, there's something to be said for this whole condition of feel, felt, found, right? Like leaning into a conversation from, I get it. There are things I have not understood about other races as well, or I may not even understand about your identity, but let's learn that thing together. The reason I leaned into, I feel like I'm overusing the word lean today, but the reason that I bent over into personal relationships is I truly believe that we have to exercise this in our personal lives. We have to become these people in order to exercise these things in our professional environments. We have to. We don't turn it on at school and turn it off when we get home. It just doesn't work that way. And if we think that it will, we will get caught up sooner or later. And we see it on social all the time, right? We see these people, these high positions, they look like they're so progressive and so wonderful, and you catch them on camera saying or doing something that is not the character that we've come to know. And so I think that we can all agree, assuming the best in others, that we're all on this in this conversation tonight so that we can move that forward. How do we become personally who we want to be, professionally, holistically? Who do we want to be? So I'm going to go to Jamal. Jamal, what's the difference in validating a viewpoint and agreeing with a viewpoint? Because I think many times we feel as though when we validate something, it means that we completely and wholly agree with it. Can you give me the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's hard. It takes heavy lifting because many times, and these are the occasions when crucial conversations were right in the middle of those conversations. And I have a phrase that I sometimes remind myself of that was shared with me some time ago, and I think it's applicable here, is I have to remind myself, sometimes you have to apologize and sometimes you have to apologize. And I say that because we communicate not just with our words, and we communicate physically, but we also communicate with what we don't do and what we don't say. And there are times when one is presenting me a viewpoint that in my mind, I'm just climbing the walls. And those are the moments when we have to have highly developed EQ. We have to know who we are, our faults in everything, to ground us in values that are not movable, not shakable during those moments, right? We're sitting at the staff room table, right? We're sitting in the backyard at the barbecues, right? And so these are moments where we have to be grounded and centered with who we are. And I think strategically, the key is in those moments, is to humanize. And I think shout out to Ingrid, she really hit that point earlier on. We have to humanize the moment and the person who's holding this viewpoint at that time. It happens to still be a human, a person who's part of our collective human experience that just happens to, have this viewpoint. So I think, validating that human being, that person, allows me not to have to validate their viewpoint, their perspective, and what does it look like in practice? I think it looks like head nods, it comes with smiles, and it sounds like, I understand, even if your inside voice is like, I understand you out your damn mind. I think those have to be times where we have to be okay with that. The universe is big enough for both truths at that moment. And maybe there are other times when we can re-engage and build a collective truth that's going to be better for humanity.
Right. I love what you said, because just sitting and listening to someone, being an active listener and not actually giving much feedback at all, it gives you the intel that you need. I love it. I love when people tell me how they really feel. I do, because what I do is I take that in, and it does allow me to create strategy about how I'm going to deal with a particular person. If I'm talking to a leader, and yes, EQ and being strategic, yes, very important, right? Like, it allows me the intel I need to be able to navigate the next conversation, should I engage or no, when I'm in the mood to have that conversation. Because if I see that person and I'm not in the mood, I may need to pivot, right, until I can actually come back. Because if not, there's going to be contention that's not going to move us forward at all, right? I love that. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to what Jamal said? No? All right. So I love that Fernanda has been talking about empathy, because man, that's the space that I thrive in. I do. I really do. I teach empathetic leadership, right? To senior leaders. So, understanding that the empathy is what is needed, right? We have to be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We have to, even the person that's, to Jamal's point, out of their damn mind, right? We have to be able to go, okay, what's going on there that would make him or her have that particular opinion? But what else is needed? What else is needed? So we got empathy, but what else do we need? Vincent, what else do we need? Want me to go to Ramona and you come back to you? Okay, Ramona, what else do we need?
Again, what else we need is, a sociolinguistic action point. Along with this, strategic action requires language, language that speaks to the indigenous language of the people of color, the language of our communities and our homes, and speaking in this language of commerce, and speaking in this language of academia, and speaking in this language of perceived standard. Which is its own microaggression. But being able to have the language to share and create these bridges and conversations feels like the beginning of honoring a people's traditions and a people's history in a way that opens the door to inclusion. And my first go-to as an artist is poetry as a poet. Mm-hmm. So what I may not be able to share or hold space for emotionally or politically, what I can share with you is the artistry of the point. I can share with you the example. I can show with you the vision, and the circumstances. It feels like this is a different conversation based on where you are. A lot of people look to monolithic kind of solutions to these kinds of positions of discomfort. Just because my other friend believes this or said this was okay, no. We have to be able to create a foundation of safety for ourselves and platform our own emotional safety, and be clear about when to recuse ourselves from the emotional labor that is required to teach when others should be learning, which is not inherently our job. However, it is the positionality many of us find ourselves in. So the language of empathy and the language of inclusion and the language of the arts is usually where I go to for this.
I love that. We have so many resources. We do, right? Like there's 1,000 different approaches to leaning into humanity, right? 1,000. Vincent, you got an answer for me now?
Yeah, I would say mutual respect, like going into like kind of like this situation, like any circumstances, like having respect, like even though like we disagree on this point or this perspective or this lived experiences may not line up, like knowing that we are both individuals and both people, both human, both deserving of love, dignity, agency, and ownership in who we are. Like that builds the foundation of being able to walk out of like disagreement in terms of being able to better understand each other because we're human, and that's like the common ground that you can start as. And with empathy, it's like you can only give people so much grace before it becomes like a thing where you can't tolerate anymore, because like sometimes it's just like where it gets to the point where people don't get it anymore. It's like, how can I always carry that weight of having to educate, having to teach people, because it's like we're already oppressed, like some of y'all mentioned. That weight can be really taxing on like mental health and just being. So I just thought there were a lot of great points tonight about like being able to like know when it's appropriate to like continue or when to stop and when to like revisit. And I think that's like an important point that is really good to be able to better understand, like to be able to approach a conversation when we're both like mentally there and ready.
Mhm. You know, I'd be interested to know from our guest today, as educators, how aware are you when microaggressions are being used? You know, perhaps you've used a microaggression or you've heard a microaggression. And without even answering that, you know, much like the college counselor, right, who said what she said, right? She didn't even understand that othered Cody and made Cody feel like he didn't belong there. So much so that he went to a HBCU, right? So, which is fine. But at the end of the day, in that moment, I witnessed that. And it didn't make me feel good to hear my son talk to like that. So how open, I'm wondering, would our educators be to creating a space where your students could call you in or call you out? And if you don't know what that is, calling in is when we have to, a microaggression is used or, you know, a derogatory statement is made, and it's not made, again, intentionally, because intent doesn't always equal the impact, but the impact is that someone felt a particular way. And while the student that you may have said it to, for instance, in that moment, Cody wasn't upset, but I was, right? And so what I would have liked to have done, what I really should have done, but I was so mad in the moment, is I should have said, can I talk to you for a second? Right? In that moment. That's calling out, gracious and respectful. Calling in is circling back in private and saying, hey, I just want to talk to you about something that you said earlier. This is how it made me feel. You weren't talking to me, but as a BIPOC person, as an LGBTQ plus person, as a young woman in a female dominated space, it made me feel a particular way. And I wanted to make you aware of it. I'm wondering how many of us would allow that space to not be defensive, but to just listen. Just listen. This is going to be our final question to you. I'd like to know what your final thoughts around the third condition are. I think this conversation has been inspiring to me. I love that we are talking about these things with our kids, because that's where I get deaded out. I'm like, I don't have kids in school anymore. I should be more involved. I'm not. Now I'm reinvigorated. I'm back in. So with that said, when we talk about the third condition, what is it that you think is important for educators to leave here with today? Aside from all of the other amazing things, what's one last gem you could drop on me? I'm gonna go to Jamal.
Great, thank you. I think at its core, the third condition is based on a few things that we all know how to do, which are share experience with others, have relationships, and connecting with each other. And I think I'll close my thoughts by giving a shout out to Margaret Wheatley, and I'll read a quote that she wrote. Because through those connections, through these shared experiences, through these relationships, we begin to listen and we begin to speak. And what she said was, human conversation is the most ancient and easiest way to cultivate the conditions for change: personal, community, organizational, planetary. If we sit together and talk about what's important to us, we begin to come alive. Share what we see, share what we feel. We listen to what others are also seeing and feeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. Ramona?
An empowered voice gives rise to vision. And this is how we can come together and honor each perspective and viewpoint. And when we feel empowered to use our voice, when we feel brave, when we feel courageous, when we turn fear into bravery, when we turn fear into courage, then we truly are able to arrive and express ourselves and our highest potential, and to be seen and heard and believed and felt. And this is a vision of freedom that begins to emerge here. A mission. And it's important to make sure that we're clear about the directives as we move forward, and plant the seeds of joy and a thriving livelihood along the way.
Thank you so much, Ramona. Fernanda?
I would say that in the last few years, what I've been trying to work on is decolonizing my mind, right? Challenge my assumptions, learn more about different cultures, even my own culture, that I was unaware of so many things because of my privileged status. Understand that, as you said, Ingrid, we can be oppressed in some areas, but we also have privileges in others. And how those two things, what are the dynamics on those, and how do we respond to when we are in the privileged area, and how we do support each other. But definitely, I will say, just starting to question things that you were taught, that you learn, unlearn about, unlearn a lot of those things, and again, bring it back to decolonizing our minds. I think that's critical.
I like that, decolonizing our minds. I like that. So I'm gonna land on my Gen Zer. We're pulling for you. You're leading us. Vincent, talk to me. How do we normalize this third condition?
I would say, as y'all are like educators, like walk with your students, not for your students. Don't make assumptions about what they need. Ask them, make sure they're centered in your classrooms, make sure they have that agency, that space, that voice to be who they are, to share their perspectives, to really lean in and have their voice heard. So walking with your students, not for your students, is my dropping point there for the night.
I would just leave you guys with this. I always think about allyship, right? Because that's really what this is. This is, how do I begin to your point, Vincent, walk hand in hand with someone? But I have to remind you of two things, or even apprise you of two things. Allyship is never self-defined. I can't say, I have all this great stuff and I'm going to give it to you. You need to tell me that this is what you need from me. So part of that is starting a conversation that says, what do you need? What do you need? How can I help you be better? What do you need? If that's your desire to be better, right? That's an assumption. The second thing would be that we all, it is a continuum. Allyship is, you have to take on You have to take your students' journey on as your own. You have to wear it and walk in it so that you can help them forge their path forward. So you have to take it on for your own. And it's not until we do that that we can really be the allies that we need to be to our students, because what we can do is we can pave a way for them. And it doesn't have to be as hard for them because we've learned the lessons, right? We know, but there's so much they can teach us. So I love what Vincent said earlier, that reverse mentorship. You know, have your students in for lunch and just talk. I don't know what it looks like, but I think we have to normalize moving forward. So that's going to close out our conversation today. I believe that we're going to open the floor for questions. I just want to say before we move forward, it has, again, been an honor to sit with these panelists. Let's give them a round of applause because their responses have been amazing, intentional, and thoughtful, and melodic. You know what I mean? Ramona has given us poetry the entire night, so I love it. Talk to me. Does anyone have a question? We can put it in. I just want to acknowledge Wonderly too. She has a lot that she has been adding to the chat. Make sure that you go there. Anna Marie is also adding some really awesome commentary in the chat as well. Do we have any questions? It's audience participation time. Really?
I do have a comment actually for Ramona. You know, I'm glad, Ramona, you're acknowledging your background, and I think it's very, very important to actually acknowledge BIPOC Indigenous people's land too when we're discussing things or when there's a event happening. It's very, very important to highlight Indigenous people's lands that we are on. And I just thank you for everybody for your insight and everything else. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being actively participating in this conversation. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else that has a question or a comment? All right, well, I'm going to turn it back over to Denise. Is it going to Denise or is it going into Okay, Denise.
Well, I'm going to just say before V jumps back on that it was amazing. And I just thank the panelists and Ingrid. You were so awesome and just transitioning and moving it along. And that's the beauty of a great panel, just having a great moderator. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And it was awesome and so thought-provoking, and just all of the information that came out was just so meaningful. Loved it, loved it. Thank you so much. I think we have a couple things to do before we end up here, and just want to remind you all just to bring another friend to our next one. And V will give you the date for our next bold conversation, and just keep these conversations going, and just really appreciate your attendance to everyone this evening.
Well, I know I can't say how many things any more time to the moderator and the panelists, and for all of the guests who stayed until now. In front of you is actually a word cloud of everybody's words. The first step is to really create a space and recognize everybody's experience. So we would like to take this time to do that, and to take a moment and for you to recognize who is in the room with you right now. And what struck me is that the word learner is so big, and we are all here to learn and to take the first step to recognize that learning is step one, to have a courageous conversation. And trying, the second largest word, is going to be step two. And usually for our courageous conversation sessions, we end with a challenge to action. You heard many people talked about the act of active listening. We would love to challenge you by the end of today to go and find somebody who has a different racial background or different cultural background, even, and to have a conversation, but provide them an opportunity for you to have an active listening and listen to their counter story. And we hope that you might find something new about that person. Um, because ultimately, it's all about recognizing their own stories. I think Ingrid was talking about taking another step, if you are ready for it, is to take it on to your own. Perhaps you can experience their story through your own perspective. Because ultimately, it's all about challenging the dominant narratives, the narratives that has been written and said by so many people as if it's just one person experience. Usually, for those who are, returners to our courageous conversation sessions, we always provide a resource for you to take home, and it's the Courageous Conversation Journal. Usually we would go into the breakout room and you would have that space, but this time we are trying something new. I just dropped in the chat a copy of the Courageous Conversations and a quick survey for those who would love to give us any feedback. The instructions in the journal will allow you to take this similar exercise and practice it with whatever your affiliations or group that you're going to try out. What does having or hosting a courageous conversation sessions look like? Last but not least, we would love to welcome you back next year. Our next sessions is on January 20th, 2022, and we'll be discussing about the fourth condition, keeping us all on the table.